Welcome back to the Neuroscience Meets Social and Emotional Learning podcast, episode number 107. With Jessica Minahan, the author of The Behavior Code, a practical guide to understanding and teaching the most challenging students. In this much needed book, based on a collaboration dating back nearly a decade, the authors Jessica Minahan, a behavioral analyst, and Nancy Rappaport, a child psychiatrist, reveal their systematic approach for deciphering causes and patterns of difficult behaviors and how to match them with proven strategies for getting students back on track to learn. My name is Andrea Samadi, and if you're new here, I'm a former educator who created this podcast to bring the most current neuroscience research, along with high-performing experts who've risen to the top of their field, with specific strategies or ideas that you can implement immediately, whether you're an educator or in the corporate space, to take your results to the next level. If you've ever heard my story of where my career began, you would know why I was so interested to speak with Jessica about the strategies in the behavior code. My first job out of the University of Toronto's Faculty of Education was a behavioral class. I felt overwhelmed and frustrated by the lack of resources to manage and teach my students. And this was one of the catalysts that drew me towards social and emotional learning back in the late 90s. If only I had read this book back then, I wouldn't have struggled so much. So let me tell you more about Jessica. She's a licensed and board certified behavior analyst, author, special educator, and consultant to schools internationally. Since 2000, she's worked with students who struggle with mental health issues and challenging behavior in public school systems. She specializes in training staff and creating behavior intervention plans for students who demonstrate explosive and unsafe behavior. She also works with students who have emotional and behavioral disabilities, anxiety disorders, or high-functioning autism. Her particular interest is to serve these students by combining behavioral interventions with a comprehensive knowledge of best practices for those with complex mental health profiles and learning needs. She's a blogger on the Huffington Post. She's the author of the Behavior Code that also has a companion guide. So there's strategies, tools, and interventions for supporting students with anxiety-related or oppositional behaviors. She holds a Bachelor in Science in Intensive Special Education from Boston University and a dual master's degree in special education in elementary ed from Wheelock College. She has a certificate of graduate study in teaching children with autism from the University of Albany and received her BCBA training from Northeastern University in Boston. She is sought after internationally to speak on subjects ranging from effective interventions for students with anxiety to supporting hard to reach students in full inclusion public school settings. So how did I come across Jessica's work? Well, a couple of Saturday mornings ago, I was at my desk and I was getting caught up from the week, and an email came in from Greg Wolcott, who I mention often on the podcast. He's an assistant superintendent from Chicago who's not only been a guest a couple times on the podcast, but he's a huge supporter. So he brainstorms ideas, topics, and guests often with me. And this time he sent me Jessica's name and said, you've really got to take a look at her. I'm on a webinar with her right now, and you've got to take a look at her for your podcast with this book, The Behavior Code. And I knew I needed to speak with her the minute I saw the title of her book. So if you're a current teacher, former teacher, or thinking about being a teacher, I'm sure that you'd want to know, what is the behavior code? As a parent, I'm still trying to figure this out, and my girls aren't even teenagers yet. So I emailed Jessica that second, and I asked if she would come on the podcast, and within hours, we had the interview set up. So let's hear what Jessica has to say about the behavior code. Welcome, Jessica. Thank you so much for taking the time out of a busy schedule where I know you've been working hard presenting on the weekends to speak with me today about your book, The Behavior Code. Before we get to the questions, Jessica, I just wanted to read one of the reviews that you have in the beginning of your book, if that's okay with you, just to kind of give the listeners a feel for what to expect from today's podcast with you.
Great. Thank you.
So we have not met until just now. So, we had talked on email, so you wouldn't know my backstory. But when I read the review in the first couple of pages of your book, it could have been written by me. So when I read this review, I just want to read it out loud. The behavior code needs to be read by all teachers, counselors, administrators, and parents. From cover to cover, I felt the authors were speaking to me, an elementary teacher. Now, I was a middle school teacher, so it's not far off, and a mom. I wasn't a mom back then, but I am now. And I felt like they knew me, knew those students who kept me awake at night. And I still wake up at night and wonder what happened to those students I taught over 20 years ago. Teachers, this book was written by authors who know what our jobs are like. And that was by Lorna, a special needs book review. So, Jessica, I've heard you say when you show up to a school to help teachers, it's usually after an incident has happened and the teachers and the admin are looking for an immediate solution, and no one says, "Hey, Jessica, how was your weekend?" They just grab you and be like, "What do we do?" Is this what you hear most often these days?
Yeah, well, teachers, principals, special ed directors, superintendents who are emailing me are pretty panicked. There's a lot of exclamation points in the subject lines. What do I do? Please come tomorrow. Where are you? And and I feel badly because it's sort of different now how the behavior is. A lot of last year when kids were in person more, some we had a lot of aggressive behaviors and different things. And now I'm really getting a lot of emails right now about student disengagement and a lot of sort of, finding a poem written by a kid and the teacher panicking. And there's this just internal distress that kids are trying to express. And, so in some ways it's less urgent than big aggressive behaviors that I often get called in for, but equally, if not more concerning.
Absolutely. And as a former educator, I feel it. And as a mom, I feel it with my two girls. So I just want to thank you so much for being here to answer some questions, to dive a little bit deeper into this book that you've written that, to me, back in the late 90s when I was a classroom teacher, there were no strategies for me out of teacher training class. They were pretty much threw me. My first teaching position out of the Faculty of Ed in Toronto was a behavioral class. And so it was me and these students with zero strategies. And, I mentioned in the backstory that it wasn't until recently, so more than 20 years later, that I started to see some books that have been written on this topic. Before I found you, I found Dr. Lori Desitel and her connections over compliance that made me see that, hey, maybe it was how I was reacting in the classroom that was actually causing the students to misbehave, because my cortisol levels impact their cortisol levels.
Right.
So why do you think there's this gap in our teacher training programs? And I studied in Toronto, and it's the same in the US. But what's happening that's creating teachers who are undertrained and overwhelmed, that I've heard you say?
Well, there's really two things happening. One is teacher prep programs, typically in the US, require 0 or 1 courses in behavior management. And as you probably remember, those are usually called classroom management. So it's a little more general than what we're talking about today. And then there's usually 0 or 1 courses mandated in mental health. A lot of times, if they do have a course, it's a survey course like Intro to Psychology or something like that. And the problem with that is the rates of kids with mental health issues are going up exponentially. So we don't have national rates yet since the pandemic, but before March in the US, the national rates for kids with anxiety is 31.9%. So for lifetime prevalence. So that means 1 in 3 kids experience clinically significant anxiety before age 18. So we can presume since the pandemic, those rates have gone up. teacher training has not adjusted, of course, this year, but in general to this trend where teachers can be looking out at a classroom with a third struggling with anxiety, 7 to 10% having ADHD, 2.5 to 10% having depression, 1 in 55 have autism. And so we're kind of training them for a classroom that doesn't exist, right? Almost 50% of their class can be struggling with different social emotional disabilities that they have very little training on. And so that's why you do this podcast, and that's why I, have spent every day in schools and across the world and decided to write the books so that we could translate the research, because a lot of the neuropsych and mental health research is not really geared for a classroom teacher with very little experience in that area. And so what I've tried to do is take the research and translate it into doable practical strategies, because I have been a teacher myself, and I was in 2 big urban public school districts in Massachusetts for 13 years in classrooms with teachers trying to help them. And so the strategies I've really put in the books and that I have learned and trained since are doable, which is really a key point, because we don't want to overwhelm the teacher while we're trying to help the student. So it needs to be practical.
Well, it makes so much sense, Jessica. When I was teaching, I think the only resource that I ever saw in my year that it was me, the students, and I always say I had this buzzer on the wall that I could buzz for help if like it was really bad, and someone would come from down the hallway and try to offer me help. But I just wish I knew some of these strategies that you talk about. And I remember thinking in my head, what's wrong with these kids? And that just shows me that I was missing some very valuable and important training. What should all teachers know about behavior? And can you explain how we can turn around even the most challenging student behavior? Like, where would we start?
You were giving me a flashback when you were describing your classroom, because my first classroom was a classroom they called the kids violent behaviorally disordered, which is not even really a label. But anyway, and I had a red button on my wall too that I tried very hard not to push. And that was just giving me a little flashback, because I started the same way. And yes, I think there's a lot of things that teachers could know about behavior. One thing is that students would behave if they could. So when a student's misbehaving, it's almost always due to an underdeveloped social skill or an underdeveloped emotional skill. And we've learned that from Ross Green and Stuart Abalon and several Harvard researchers. We make a lot of judgments on their chronological age. Like, he should be able to wait for 10 minutes. He's in 6th grade. That's an assumption of his self-regulation skill of waiting based on his chronological age. And the problem is the chronological age doesn't indicate to us at all where someone's social or emotional skills are. The only thing that will indicate that is the behavior. So when a kid's misbehaving, I just get really curious, like, I wonder what skills are underdeveloped there. And since we're kind of talking about anxiety, that's on the forefront of our mind today, there are 5 neurobiological skills that are impacted when you're anxious. So when anxiety goes up, 5 particular skills go down. One is self-regulation. The other is executive functioning, which has a lot to do with initiating and persisting with tasks, which is why we see a lot of disengagement with anxious kids. Flexible thinking, that's where you can get in a power struggle. I don't know if you've ever said to a 5-year-old, put on your winter coat, and they say no, and you could be there for an hour, right? Because they get less flexible the more stressed and agitated they are. Accurate thinking is a tough one. And when anyone is anxious, we think on the downside, we think negatively. And so, for example, if you were going to an important meeting and you hit a traffic jam, and you look at the clock and you're now 6 minutes late, you're usually not thinking happy, comforting thoughts to yourself. You're probably thinking, more stressful thoughts, which actually increases the anxiety. And so inaccurate thinking is a huge culprit to why kids behave in certain ways. And unfortunately, that's where teachers have the least amount of training. So I do try to show a lot of strategies there. Another skill is social skills, the last one. Usually the specific social skill impacted when you're anxious is perspective taking, understanding someone else's thoughts and feelings. So for example, if you're walking down the hallway, if you get out of your car at work, I hope I don't jinx you, and you spill coffee on your shirt, and you're walking down the hallway with your big coffee stain, anyone glancing in your direction, because you're self-conscious, you kind of presume they're noticing your coffee stain, and anyone kind of glancing in your direction, you kind of presume they're thinking something negative. Just remember the coffee stain moment where you're trying to understand the perspective of someone with anxiety, that there's a distortion in perception where things are about me and people have negative intent. So if I walk into a classroom, 2 kids are laughing, I may interpret that they're laughing at me. And that, of course, can lead to more anxiety and more issues. So that's really important to know, that there are skills that are contributing to the behavior issue. And this is why incentives do not really work. So when I am called in, usually there's some sort of incentive plan going on. Get your work done and you get 5 extra points, or get all your homework done this week, and, parents try a pizza party or something. And the reason that's not solving a lot of problems is because incentives do not teach skills. All an incentive will do is increase your motivation. So if you said to me, Jess, can you speak in French for the rest of this workshop for our listeners who speak French? I'll give you, $500. I would be motivated by the $500, but I cannot speak French. So the incentive won't matter. You could make it $1 million and French won't just start coming out of my mouth. So the incentives don't really help teach skills. And when a kid's anxious and these skills drop, incentives aren't going to help you in that moment because you're not addressing the skills.
Got it. But how would we actually look for the underlying cause behind a behavior? Like this to me was eye-opening, because I used to just see my kids, when I was trying to teach and I had turned my back, there was things flying around the classroom. I never thought, like, why are they doing that? I never thought of looking for a cause. But what are some basic things that you could think about in your head if you're a beginning teacher and there's behavioral issues happening? Where could we even begin with finding the cause?
Yeah, well, the first thing is knowing there is a cause is the first step, and not making assumptions about behavior. So I would hesitate to just sort of say, oh, he's just being non-compliant, or he's just doing that for attention, or he's trying to get out of something, because we didn't do an analysis. And what I have found is it's much more complicated why kids are behaving certain ways. And so our initial assumption can often be unhelpful. So the first thing I would do is I'm a behavior analyst. And so I like to sort of look for patterns, because a lot of behavior commonly has patterns. One really nice way to do that is through ABC data, which is just 3 columns, ABC, and A stands for antecedent, which just means what happened right before. Then you describe the behavior. And then consequence, we use that word wrong as behavior analysts. We just mean response, like how do kids respond, how do teachers respond. But the antecedent is the most important to me, especially when we're talking about kids with anxiety, because when you analyze what is occurring right before a behavior, patterns will start to emerge. And we can, when we put interventions into those antecedents, we can bypass the behavior, of course. The nice way. And then the second thing you want to do is look at an analysis of the underdeveloped skills contributing to behavior. So first the antecedents, and then which underdeveloped skills. And those 2 pieces of information will help us come up with some solutions. To make it easier, I do sort of, extend my 18 years of work in sort of summarize some of the patterns that I see in terms of the antecedents. There's 6 common ones. One is unstructured times, which is so much less now because if we are in person, there's fewer kids and they can't go to recess really and cafeterias and stuff like that, where a lot of kids have trouble, especially with self-regulation issues. Transitions are a huge culprit of where kids can be non-compliant, not follow directions. And there's, that's totally in the wheelhouse of a teacher to make a few changes so we can prevent that. Writing demands, a lot of kids, avoid writing more than other things. And there's reasons for that. A lot of it is due to the inaccurate thinking. So for example, if a kid's flooded with negative thoughts and they're staring at a piece of paper, a graphic organizer is not going to help that kid start. It's a different toolbox. And so that's why you want to look at the underdeveloped skills too. Social demands, independent work is very hard for kids. That's what, I think virtual teaching has exposed, is how much help kids really do get, even though we call it independent work. The teacher goes over, nudges them along, keeps them going, gets them started. So independent work would be the fifth one. And then novelty or unexpected change does not go well, particularly for kids with anxiety or flexible thinking issues. So, we have our list of underdeveloped skills and we have our list of common antecedents, and sort of looking at those two pieces of information is a really fabulous way to start thinking about interventions.
And as you're talking, I'm just thinking about how much work or training is so important for the educator, and why I was kind of set up to fail because I didn't have this way of thinking. I just had my students sitting there and I was like, why aren't they doing the worksheets? And you just listed the most common ones. And I'm sure every one of my students had one of those common reasons for not doing their work.
Right.
So just thinking about how important these skills are, just to know that from my point of view as a teacher, what could have been different if I had done things a little differently. More success for sure.
Right.
And how do you tie in social and emotional skills into behavioral control? So in chapter 1 of your book, you actually mentioned an incident with a student named Alyssa, and she blows up at another student. And then you had a chart showing the SEL skills that were missing that need to be taught. How can teachers assess the strategies you outline in a situation like this in real time? Like, let's say, I'm in the cafeteria, something happens, and the idea is that we don't want to have more disruption, but what could we do to keep the situation calm, and then figure out what skills we need to teach those students and then get those skills in place? There's a lot to unpack in an explosive situation in a cafeteria, right?
Right. Yeah, I think the best thing a teacher can do is to be as prepared as possible, of course. And so I think you want to make, if they could pull from a toolkit in that moment, that would be the best possible way. So for each underdeveloped skill, like self-regulation, there are a couple strategies, really go-to strategies that teachers can learn, or something like inaccurate thinking. Actually, those are pretty tied. So for a lot of kids who, get upset, we try different things like pull them aside and keep talking about it, or we give them directions. And a lot of kids, when they're that escalated, can't really think rationally. So if we're saying, oh, this is the reason this is happening, but give them a lot of sentences, that's not particularly useful. For example, when a lot of dysregulation, oppositional, defiant kind of moments are rooted in anxiety. And so what we often do is give kids breaks too. We'll say, go for a walk. That's a common thing. If there was a cafeteria incident, I would see the teacher say, go for a walk, like, take space from this. And there are a couple common teacher practices that might be unhelpful. This is one of them, because when you have a kid take a walk, they can be ruminating about what they're angry about that whole time. And a lot of times when I take the data, they come back not more regulated. And that doesn't, and it might persist if the kid sees him later in that day and stuff like that. And so just like when we can't sleep at night, We either read a book or watch TV to help us go back to sleep, because obviously if we stay on the thought or thoughts, we will stay awake. We have to get off the thought, distract ourselves to calm down, to go back to sleep. So it's sort of counterintuitive in a lot of when kids are escalated, but what you really don't want them to persist on that thought or what they're angry about, because they will stay dysregulated. So cognitive distractions or thought breaks are much more evidence-based for kids who are dysregulated. And so for example, saying to a kid, go get a drink of water, they can be standing out there kind of still ruminating about what's bothering them, or go sit in the calming corner. A lot of elementary schools have calming corners, calming chairs, which is great to set up. But one misstep there is we say, go back there and calm down, and the kid's ruminating and thinking about what they're upset about. And so in my data, they don't actually come back calmer. That's true of kids with more internalized behavior. I had a girl who was picking her skin so badly, she was, bleeding in her classes, and they gave her a drawing notebook. But we noticed she was still picking, and she still couldn't get back to work after, which is really the point of a break, is for the kid to be more regulated after. So a kid who's really upset in the cafeteria, or a kid who's picking their skin, you want them calmer as quick as possible. And so, drawing, she was still ruminating while she was drawing when I interviewed her. So what we did for her, and the way I describe it to kids, is your brain is like a remote control. You're stuck on this channel. You need to change the channel to calm down. You can't stay on that channel and calm down. And so we gave her, for example, 3 pieces of Sudoku, that math game with the little boxes, instead of drawing. And she, almost no picking. She could get back to work within 15 to 20 seconds. Over the next 2 weeks, we took data, much better. For a kid, I wouldn't want them, an angry kid who you say, okay, go for a walk in the cafeteria, have them pacing around the hallway, because it also could cause another incident in the hallway to have an escalated person. So, distracting them and saying, you need to change the channel. I'm going to talk to you about this in about 5 minutes. That's a much better response than trying to talk to the kid. It's almost like throwing kindling on a fire as you keep talking to a kid who's really escalated. So I think it sounds sort of counterintuitive that you would want to distract the thought of an escalated person, but actually, if they stop thinking about what's angering them, you see their whole body calm. And then what happens is the anxiety goes down, the skills come back up, and now you can have a more rational conversation with the kid. So I think kind of knowing a few go-tos like that can be very useful for teachers to make sure they're not misstepping.
Do you ever use that strategy of asking the student to name what's bothering them, like name it to tame it idea? Do you think that would help this situation if a student is ruminating, to tell you about it? Would that help?
It depends on the student, and some students are not that metacognitive. And when you're very anxious, kids with trauma histories, right? So trauma triggered or very anxious, the top-down processing in your brain, the rational thought and the executive functioning is impaired, and the limbic area, the emotional center of your brain, is sort of the one doing all the work. So it depends on how escalated the kid is. It depends on where their metacognitive skills are anyway. I've met 5-year-olds that are more metacognitive than some teenagers who, grunt, I don't know, I just get mad. They can't really figure it out. So it's kind of a hard question, even for adults, to say, why do you think you acted that way, that's a hard question to answer. And that's why people go to therapy for years, So I think that's a better question maybe when everyone's calm. And I do show kids they have patterns of behavior. I do talk about, like a teenage girl who goes out of class a lot to check in with a counselor. I just was consulting on a case. And so what we did is we showed her there's really 2 reasons you always come out. it's academic performance anxiety or social conflict. But she doesn't know that. Every time she comes out, she's just talking about the details of the one situation, and the teacher said this and it made her feel this and blah, blah, blah. And that could go on, and then she comes back the next. So what we did is we said, you have this pattern of behavior. And so when she's not upset, we would say, when you come into the office, it's either this or this. And we gave her 5 or 6 strategies for each situation. So we would say, so then when she's upset and she comes in, we could say, I'm going to interrupt you there. I'm so sorry you're upset. You always want to validate the feeling. I'm sorry you're upset, but I'm going to interrupt you there. Do you think this is social conflict or academic performance anxiety? Oh, I think it's academic. Okay, what are your strategies, right? So it's really helpful. I think that conversation is helpful, but you need to do a little prep first, and the kid has to really understand their behavior at a certain level to do that.
This is really good. I would have had my 30 students off to be brain scientists if I had known this back then. But what about, where would an adult begin for this? Like, a lot of people are listening to this podcast. So it kind of shocked me when I launched it. I launched it about a year and 8 months ago, and we're now into 136 countries. We're almost at 50,000 downloads, and the numbers are just going up and up. So I know that people are looking for ways to learn this, but where would a teacher, parents begin to learn these strategies for themselves first?
Yeah. Oh, for themselves or for their toolkit?
Yeah, for themselves, because when you're telling a student something, and if you're not doing it yourself, they just don't have the belief in you. You have to have these skills yourself first to have anyone trust or believe in you, right?
Well, one thing for a really stressed teacher is you don't want to overwhelm them more. That's the main thing. And so I tell teachers, do not be afraid to ask for help. I think sometimes we're trying to figure it out for way too long. A lot of times I was called in, and I wish I was called in a month prior to when they called me, right? And there is a little, so I would love to normalize that we're all in this together, and to not be afraid to ask for help. In a really kind of heated moment, it's really helpful to switch off with another adult, and just give yourself space to get your cortisol down, and your limbic area a little calmer, and your frontal lobe kicking in a little more. All those things happening. Space and time really do help that. I think there are, again, some really, it's not, what I try to do in my trainings is it's not as overwhelming as you think. Behavior has these patterns, and they're really common things. Like, for example, teachers can have a few go-to ways of giving a direction that will lead to cooperative response. There's a lot of ways of giving a direction that will lead to an escalated person, or a kid who gets real defensive. For example, an authoritative tone of voice, which was more common in the day than it is now, in a public direction, like take your hood off in front of a whole bunch of kids. That's the least likely to go well. And then you're going to get in a situation where now you have 2 stressed people, the teacher and the kid, and there's a sort of a power struggle. So, for example, I like sort of cheat sheets. That's what I call them, because I think that's one of the best things for teachers. Like, one is, private and nonverbal directions go better. So, for example, if you have a kid who's humming Happy Birthday song really loudly while you're trying to teach, that would be annoying. I wouldn't go walk over to that kid, give him eye contact, and publicly say to stop humming, right? I see a lot of teachers do that. I wouldn't recommend that. In fact, when you walk straight towards a kid who's anxious, you actually often increase the anxiety. If you're standing over a kid, even a tall high school kid sitting, you're activating certain alerting parts of the brain, like this is a vulnerable spot. So that's not a common thing to do. So what I would do is not do any of those things. I'd stay way over in the front of the bulletin board and just write on a sticky note, please stop humming. Put it on their desk without commenting or even really looking at them. And then you're going to think I'm joking, but I'm dead serious. Like, run 6 to 8 feet away, be really busy talking to someone else. Because I love the Spanish proverb, if one will not, two cannot argue, right? So if a teacher says to me, he argues with me all the time, he negotiates with me all the time, which is so stressful to both parties, you're 50% of that volley. And so there's lots of ways you can give direction that you'll just avoid that. For example, another one would be to give the reason before the direction. So what typically adults, if there's a kid spills pencils on the floor, we would say, can you pick those up? And then we give the reason. I don't want to fall. But the kid has now been called out, right? There's sometimes a reaction to that if there's any trauma history or some of that distortion that happens with anxiety that we talked about. So you've had kids who like feel like you yelled at them or feel like, all this stuff happened. So instead you just flip it and give the reason first. So their rational brain is still with you. And you can say, oh, I hope I don't fall on these because I have such a bad knee. I really don't want to hurt my knee. Could you pick these up? It'll just go so much easier. And then you bypass the whole neurobiological cascading problems that could have occurred if you did it otherwise. Choices is another thing. If instead of saying sit down, you could say, do you want to sit here or here? Instead of line up, do you want to line up in the front of the line or the back of the line? When you give a little choice, it gives the kid a little control, which, control makes kids feel more comfortable, reduces anxiety. So there's what I try to do in my trainings is I give cheat sheets like that, because when you're stressed, you might give a direction like sit down, pick that up. And those are going to add to the whole problem. And so there are some go-tos that you can sort of just get used to and sort of make a habit of mind that will prevent so many issues in the classroom and keep everyone calmer, especially the teacher.
Oh, I love these. These are so helpful, Jessica. So I know that you go into depth on your FAIR intervention plan that's in chapter 2 of your book. And I've heard you go into depth on a podcast, and I put the link in the show notes so you don't have to go all in depth again about your plan. But could you give like an overview of how we would use this FAIR plan in practice with an anxiety related behavior, something that we're all experiencing, the steps?
Sure. So the first step again is to look at that antecedent, right, pattern and those underdeveloped skills. And so we really want to know those up front. So what a teacher would do is if you had a little ABC chart, which by the way, you can download from the internet, don't make one for yourself, just Google ABC data chart, 1 million will come up for you. If you write 5 incidents on that piece of paper, patterns will come up to you. So that's what I would say. That's the F part of FAIR. F stands for functions. You want to know, like, what are the patterns? What is, triggering is a word. A lot of counselors use this behavior. The A part of FAIR is the accommodations. So for all the underdeveloped skills, we want to make sure we're putting accommodations in place. Like, for example, for an inflexible kid, the accommodations I just shared with how you can give a direction. If you give directions in that way, give the reason first, do them privately with a sticky note. That's a good accommodation for an inflexible kid. So by putting that in place, you're going to bypass these, big problems. So in A, you want to look at what is the underdeveloped skill and make sure you have some accommodations in the classroom. And then we also want to teach the skill to the kid. And then I stands for interaction strategies. And I know since you have started out the same way I did, that there's kids with mental health issues, their success, social emotional behavior issues, their success is very person dependent in a building. For example, the 3rd grade teacher, is so child whispery, the kid does great that year. And then the next year it's a substitute teacher who's kind of got an inflexible personality, and the kid and the teacher are kind of butting heads. And that can even have high stakes. We might even be saying, like, does he need a outside placement? But there are certain things that the child whispery teacher is doing. Like, in the US, we have, private, like a lot of places, we have private schools just for kids with social emotional issues. And then we have the public schools, and sometimes there's a decision, should this child stay in public school or should they go to a special classroom or a special school? And when you really look at one of the biggest variables why kids do well in some of the social emotional schools and classrooms is the teachers in those programs have these relational skills that are very trauma informed. And so for me, when I was a consultant and I didn't add that information, I was at a loss. Like, I would come in and show a teacher what to do and I'd leave. And then the teacher would say, it didn't work when I did it. And what I forgot to add was how to make the kid feel comfortable with you, how to let the kid feel safe. So things like, so interaction strategies, every behavior plan I write, there's a section called interaction strategies where I actually write out how to interact. So why let the teacher figure it out? And that's something we don't give advice to. Like, when he's doing well in English class, but not in math class, the English teacher doesn't come over and say, I never give a public direction because he feels uncomfortable, or something like public praise, right? That's the number one way we give praise as adults. Most uncomfortable way to receive praise, though. So I don't know if you know kids, when you praise them, they look uncomfortable, they cover their paper, they say the opposite, they even argue with you. So, actually it's safer to assume they don't like it than they like it, because there's more kids that don't. And so when you see discomfort with praise, the public part is probably the problem. And I just say to teachers, pull them aside and say, when I'm proud of you, how should I let you know? Should I do a thumbs up? Should I give you a sticky note? Can you check at my desk before you leave the class? And then that would go into the interaction strategies document. Sometimes you just have that. So when I'm consulting to teachers, I will hand them a piece of paper that says things like, avoid public praise. He prefers a thumbs up. 2 for 10, 2 minutes a day for 10 days. Talk to him about nothing school related, so you get to know his interests. By the way, greet him at the door and ask him one of his interests within the first 2 minutes you see him. So, some teachers know to say, hey, how you doing? Did you see the game last night? Other teachers might say, where's your homework? Or you're late, right? And that's, going to be really different. And so you sort of, I quantify, because to me, these are accommodations. If they're not in place, kids can't access curriculum, because when you're anxious, you can't. And when you don't feel safe, you can't learn. So putting these in place really concretely is useful for all staff members. And I wouldn't assume, saying build a relationship is adequate. 2 for 10 is much more concrete. Greet them at the door. Instead of standing over them when you're helping them with their work, get down to their eye level and to the side of their desk. That's more trauma informed than being in front of them. Those kind of things I actually write out for teachers, so I don't have to just expect that they'll figure it out. So that's the I part. And then R is responses. So when we teach skills and strategies to kiddos, in the R is I sort of talk about how the best way to respond, right? So like the cafeteria incident, I might say, you need to distract him, tell him to change his channel, and, or ask him two sports trivia questions real quick, get his brain distracted, calm him down, then maybe talk to him. And I write all that out in responses. I also love if people do like incentive charts, and I know that's very popular, sticker charts, and with older kids, behavior contracts and stuff. If you're going to reinforce a kid like that, use a sticker or give points. I would do it on, did you use a strategy? Not did you complete your work, but did you use a strategy? And so that would be outlined in the R2, like what strategies that you want to be reinforcing when you see. So your response to seeing any strategy would be reinforcement, so that we see kids with more skills, less behavior, or more skills, less behavior as the months go on throughout the year.
Got it. And if you've got a class with students that have anxiety related behavior, to think about how my tone of voice would be with them, how I'm speaking, like bend down so I'm speaking more in their eyes. I'm just kind of reviewing some strategies that I could think of, because I have a child that gets pretty anxious, and I know that I'm probably doing everything wrong. Like, is your homework done? And, her eyes bulge out. So I'm just thinking about, even as a parent, how
Yeah,
can I be talking to my.
of course. Well, and that it's really helpful to share and write out. I mean, so when I'm consulting to a teacher, I had this teacher recently taught math and was getting into, kids were leaving the class and not, really disengaged, pretending they're asleep, like having a lot of trouble. And so I didn't want to just say something generic like build a relationship, because I think more specific would be better for certain people. And in general, why reinvent the wheel if you have the same kid? Like PE teachers and art teachers and music teachers know kids for years, or coaches, right? Know kids at this different level. And it's really helpful. Like I like to make interaction strategies a Google Doc, password protected. So if you can only read it if you work with the kid, and share it with everyone. Cafeteria staff can say something that will, set off a kid. It's helpful to know this child, like substitute teachers. It'd be nice for the first page of the substitute teacher plan to include this kind of social emotional trauma informed interaction strategies. You'd have to be redacted. You can't give confidential information, but you could say 3 kids in the class lost their mothers. Please don't bring up Mother's Day.
Mhm.
The tallest kid in the class is very self-conscious. Don't make a comment or a joke, right? And you just help them out, so kids feel a little more comfortable with this unfamiliar adult. And in general, it bothers me that we don't quantify this, because when you look at where a kid can learn, why can he learn in English class and why can't he learn in math class? It's these sort of intangible, unwritten accommodations that we're using. So I think of them as accommodation. I write them out, hold people accountable, and try to be specific.
I know, and it's interesting as you're talking, I'm thinking about my oldest daughter. She's in 6th grade, and she comes home and tells me, we were so bad for this one teacher today, or a substitute, but we would never dream of misbehaving for this one teacher.
Right.
And I'm like, why? Why would you misbehave, all of you? And I feel like it's that connection, like you said, it's the relationship is not there with the teacher. It's missing. And
Yeah.
so the
And
behavior.
I think it can be even part of like how principals evaluate teachers. I mean, that needs to be really specifically taught and in place for kids to learn and behave well. Like you said, if they don't have a connection with the teacher and don't feel cared for or safe, kids can't learn, and also they often don't behave well. So it's very interesting, because I bet in your career no one handed you a piece of paper and said this is how to interact best with this kid, and that would be very useful, even though like you and I have the instincts, in that area, but still it's super useful. Public praise is something I forget all the time. It's my personality to sort of spaz out when a kid does something right, and I always have to go, "Oops, that wasn't the right thing to do," because their reaction was not great. So I think it takes the instinct out of it and the guesswork, and really, call a duck a duck. These have to be in place for kids to learn and behave well.
Definitely. And knowing little things about each of the students and tying them in. Like I just remember my 6th grade teacher had a nickname for all of us, and I never forgot that teacher. And then I thought about how was I with my students, and I could tell you now, like over 20 years later, there was one kid that loved movies, and another kid really was into music, and I could have used that, but I don't know why I didn't make the connection. I was too busy trying to get them to do the work on their paper, and not thinking of making that connection, which it, I could have got me a lot farther with that connection for sure.
Yeah. And virtually, it's a little harder to feel connected to students. And so I recommend an interest survey that they fill out, sort of expedites the get to know you. I recommend teachers, if you can, try to say each student's name 2 times before you log off an online class. Even kids with that negative distortion, if they hear their name twice, it's likely they will feel seen or heard or important. It can feel very, disconnected when they're muted. It feels a little unnatural. So that can be helpful. Things like voice commenting on Google Docs. There's an extension called Mote, M-O-T-E, on Google, where you can leave voice comments instead of written comments. So a kid sitting at home alone can just, click on it and hear, I love the beginning of this. That was really fun. And just have this moment with you, like that we would do in the classroom. I also love teachers to create a little file in their online classrooms just for what are you up to, because what you're at the risk for in virtual teaching is you're only sort of interacting around academics. But if you put a folder and you get an interest survey and you find out the kid loves to build Lego buildings, a little kid or an older kid draws cartoons, after reading the interest survey, you could email them and say, could you take a picture and put it in the file privately or publicly? And then you can sort of get that more three-dimensional awareness of the kid and comment on things other than academics and share a story like, oh, I love that cartoon too. And those are things we would do in the classroom. If a kid walked in and had graffiti drawn on the back of their notebook, we would say, did you draw that? You're an amazing artist. And in 2 seconds, we learned about the kid. We validated them as not just a student. And so that can be replicated too. But, it does feel harder virtually.
Yeah, all my teacher friends tell me about it. And I just wanted to ask you, let's just travel back in time over 20 years ago. You open up my classroom door and you peek in, you see the buzzer on the wall and you walk in. What would you have said to me as a first year teacher with all the knowledge and skills? You'd see all my students. I could name most of them that, they still think about them all. You walk in, you walk up to me and I would say, oh, Jessica, it's so great to see you. I'm really thinking of quitting, breaking my contract, leaving teaching and leaving the country. I'm thinking of moving to the US from Toronto. I'm just so burnt out. What would you have said to me at that time?
Well, I would first validate how hard teaching is. I think people who have never taught do not get it. It is really one of the hardest, and we do not have the right training to deal with all the things that a teacher is really being asked to do. And so, first of all, I would validate the feeling. But what I would encourage teachers who are feeling like that is that it's not as overwhelming as you think. Like I said, there are 5 big, or 6, big antecedents that occur. There's 5 underdeveloped skills. And so when you kind of think about that, it's like one of these 5 and one of these 6. That, it can be others too, of course. It's not a finite list, but that kind of idea helps, I think, great deal. I think the other thing, I would say is, ask for more professional development. Professional development is the first thing that's cut. And the way kids are now, right? The middle school kids are the first group of children who grew up with technology as it is, with tablets and smartphones and stuff like that. And there's a couple of ramifications of that. And yet the professional development is not keeping up with things. Like, for example, a lot of teachers say, and again, there's just commonplace teacher practices that might be unhelpful. And you sort of start uncovering those. Like, for example, to help kids transition, teachers often say 5 more minutes, like the count. 5 more minutes and we're going to clean up. Now, the problem with that is a lot of us think we're communicating more than we are. So a kid with very strong executive functioning skills will hear that and then make a plan for the allotted amount of time. Other kids, like, they'll increase their pace or not just start the new chapter because they know they don't have enough time to stop it. A lot of kids, like at home, when you say, honey, we're leaving the house in 5 minutes, they're like, great, I'll start a movie. Like, they make this terrible 5-minute plan and then you're going to lead to a whole other problem. So what I recommend is not assume. Actually, I love when you say 5 more minutes to a kid, then ask them, what's your 5-minute plan? And you get the most fascinating answers, because when you're on technology a lot, it does impact your internal sense of time. And so kids, because of technologies, are not as developed in certain skills, like, for example, social skills. I don't know. Remember when we could go to restaurants? Like, have you ever seen a family of 4 all staring at their phones, not interacting at all in a restaurant, right? Teenagers text each other. They don't talk. So a kid who's grown up with that, adults, technology behavior is a big contributing factor where they're not interacting with kids because they're on their phones. And so, high school teachers always tell me it feels like I teach middle school. Middle school teachers say I feel like I teach elementary school. And that's where a lot of burnout comes. It's like, I didn't have to do this 10, 15 years ago. And if you're comparing a kid now to a kid 10, 15 years ago, that's true. They're less socially practiced. The skill of waiting, for example. Like when I grew up, we were in long lines with my mom and we had long car rides where we were bored and we just had to figure out how to be bored and wait. Now, there's self-checkout, there's delivery, you can order a coffee, go in and it's sitting right there for you. Kids don't, if they're in a long car ride, they're watching movies. So kids just haven't developed. And so the time concept is also one of those. When you're on your phone, you lose track of time. You don't feel the time passing. So kids haven't sort of developed that schema of what is 5 minutes. So, saying 5 more minutes, but adding action steps, 5 more minutes, which means you can go down the slide 2 more times, 5 more minutes, which means you can, do 2 more math problems. Parents helping kids stop technology is a big issue. Like they'll say, you can have screen time till 5 o'clock, or you can have screen time for 1 hour. That's a problem because at 5 o'clock, they're halfway up the mountain. And so they'll be non-compliant with that direction. 10 minutes prior or 5 minutes prior to the, time they should stop. They should think, I don't have enough time to climb that mountain, make a better decision. And that's what they don't do. So if you did that 5-minute check, 5 minutes, what's your 5-minute plan? And the kid says, climb a mountain. You have a moment to say that's probably not a reasonable 5-minute plan. Why don't you go over there and blah, 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 get some coins? Or if your direction is you have 10 more minutes, you can only probably kill 2 more of those green guys or build 1 more hamburger or whatever they're doing on the computer and kind of translate it. Those transitions will go so much more smoothly. So, that's an example of like a common teacher practice that's probably going to be unhelpful. Yet everyone does it. So in student teaching, the person who taught you did it too. And so it's, but it's not as overwhelming as you think. Like we do have different kinds of kids now. That's why a lot of people are getting exhausted but there are really easy practical strategies that can meet kids where they're at right now.
Oh, Jessica, this is so helpful. I wish I knew you back in the day. I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today, to share your research, these strategies. And it's all in an area I'm so deeply invested in. And I know those who tune into the podcast will find this very helpful. If people want to learn more about your books, your articles, your radio and podcasts, they can go to your website, jessicaminahan.com. I'll put all that in the show notes. And to follow you on social media, they can find you on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook. Is there anything else, anything else you want to share? Any final thoughts for people on the behavior code to give us some hope?
Well, I want everyone to know that it's much more doable than it feels. When you have a little more information, your instincts are going to be more spot on. Your reactions to things will be more spot on. So, and it's just, I think, getting more information, learning more, and make sure that you're learning from people who translate it into practical classroom strategies. That it really is very doable. And it's a few little switches, like saying, instead of a movement break, doing a distraction break is not much more time from you, or saying 5 more minutes, which means is not much more time for you, but these things will be much more effective because they're neurobiologically informed, anxiety informed. So it's not learning a whole new thing. It's just shifting a little bit what we're doing to take into account, what's best for kids.
Love it. Thanks so much, Jessica. I'm going to try out some of your strategies right away.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
It's been wonderful. I look forward to learning more from you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.